Hey guys, and welcome back to the Curious Curators. I'm Hope, but for this episode, you can call me Moneybags.
And I'm Lindsay, the Shiv Shirkey.
And if you can't guess, today we're going to talk to you about American gangsters.
And mobsters.
And just real interesting people.
Public enemy number one.
My dream job.
No, if you're watching this on video, you might notice that one of us dressed up for this podcast.
And the other one forgot.
The other one is the one who mentioned dressing up. But no, the Shiv is the only one who dressed up, even though Moneybags was the one who suggested it.
To be fair, I dressed up like a Visco girl.
Great.
So, I did dress up, just not properly.
Alright.
But you know what? We tried.
No, you didn't.
You tried, and you look fantastic.
Thank you.
So when we say American gangsters and mobsters, we do want to say that we are talking about probably around 1900 to 1950. We're not going to get into a bunch of the later ones, even though we clearly know that there are a lot before and a lot after. But we had to make a time frame or this podcast could last hours.
Oh, this could last hours just with what we've already discussed, 1900 and 1950s gangsters and mobsters. Those are...
There will be more of these, I'm sure, because we actually really enjoyed, I think, researching this one.
Yeah.
And I learned a lot researching this one.
Yeah, definitely.
Not all of it good.
Oh, well, yeah, obviously.
So I think for this, we're kind of talking about, I guess, are they kind of, would you call them like early mobsters? Kind of the start of the mob as we know it, even?
Yeah, I would say so.
And so this is like Prohibition era, Depression era, and then into the Public Enemy era.
Yes.
Which is the same as Depression era, really, but they kind of started calling them something a little bit different. And this is also the beginning of the FBI.
Yes.
And we'll get into the FBI later, don't you worry about that. But I think a lot of these, or some of these people are going to be called like public enemies. And I do have a definition of that.
All right, go for it.
But my definition comes from the FBI's website.
Well, they're the ones who designate public enemies, I believe, so go ahead.
You are right. So they kind of said that the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice made use of the term public enemy in the 1930s, an era in which the term was synonymous with fugitive or notorious gangster. And it was used in speeches, books, press releases, and internal memoranda, and remains in usage to this day. But I don't necessarily think that they call anyone public enemy now. They're just like top 10 most wanted list.
Yeah, I never hear really that reference anymore.
So, and this was like Hoover era.
Right.
So, I think a lot of these guys that we're going to talk about guys and girls.
Guys and girls, yes.
Don't necessarily have like the worst reputation with the people, or they didn't back in the day, but the FBI and their state
law enforcement.
Yeah, everyone, like the
I shouldn't
guys.
say law enforcement because a lot of the police officers were bribed.
Right. So like the good guys.
Yeah.
I'm gonna use quotes for that. Were, and you'll see why later, were kind of against them, but the media portrayal of them, I think for the most part, wasn't bad unless something happened later to make it bad for them, and people didn't really dislike them.
Well, media portrayal, I mean, some of the newspapers were bought off.
Right.
In order to post a positive story.
Which we won't get into.
Because Al Capone did that.
Yeah, I think a lot of them, or they were friends with someone in the media that just was like, man, they're great, look at them. And it just kind of went wild. But I think that they're all pretty interesting. There were so many people to choose from, so just know that we're not going to be able to talk about them all, ever.
No, absolutely not. We kind of picked ones that were interesting to us.
Yeah, so we picked our favorites.
Yeah, we definitely did. We picked ones that and we picked a few that we just had to talk about. Like, you couldn't go talk about gangsters and mobsters and public enemy number one without bringing up Al Capone. That would be an incomplete podcast, so we do talk about a few that we felt almost obligated to discuss.
Yeah, I felt like that about a couple of them that especially the ones I panic researched this morning. I was like, I can't not talk about these people, and here we go. So should we go ahead and get started talking about some of them? I think
absolutely.
You want to go first, or would you like me to go first?
Yeah, I'll just preface with a little bit of just a few of the gangs and mobs that you should be aware of. Some of the most famous ones, you had the Chicago Outfit, which obviously was a Chicago-based mob gang from 1910 to present, actually. They kind of rose to power in 1920s under Johnny Torrio and Al Capone. It was pretty much known for its bloody gang wars for the control and the distribution of alcohol during Prohibition. So that's something that you're going to hear about, especially with regards to Al Capone. Then you have Murder, Inc.
Such a good name.
Such a good name. I'm so mad that they took that name. Which was an organized crime group in the 1930s to 40s, and they were the enforcement arm for the Jewish and Italian mob. They were almost their own separate entity, and they were responsible for 400 to 1,000 contract killings, and they were based in New York. Also in New York were the Five Families, which was the 5 major organized crime families in New York. They were the Italian-American mafia, essentially. And they were organized by Salvatore Maranzano in 1931, and he was the boss of all bosses. And all of them had to report to him.
Also a great name.
Boss
I'm
of all
actually a little bit
bosses,
jealous, but that's fine.
So those are like the big 3 that are going to come up, at least with regards to mafia, mobs, and big-time gangs, with regards to some of the people that I wrote about.
Okay. Well, I went with the kind of like outlaw gangsters, I guess. The ones that were like robbing banks and just like running around. And honestly,
what a good name too, Robin Banks.
Robin Banks. Oh my gosh, that's a great one. We're gonna have to write all this down. Oh wait. So I kind of started off just dealing with like some of my favorites, and I ended up writing down a bunch of stuff about Dallas, Texas, which we talked about that before. I don't think anyone really thinks of Dallas, especially like 1930s Dallas, as this poppin' metropolis that is like building gangsters. But Dallas was a growing city, and it's in North Texas, so it's accessible. It's about 3 hours from Shreveport, and it's quite close to like Oklahoma.
Okay.
My geography of Texas leaves a lot to be desired, but the first people that I kind of talked about from anywhere, the first people that I researched were Bonnie and Clyde.
No surprise.
Both Dallas born, both poor kids that didn't want to be poor anymore. They were from the wrong side of like the river, so like West Dallas, which when I'm thinking of Dallas, that means nothing to me because Dallas is so big now that you just can't. But so they were from West Dallas, which is like the wrong side of the river, and they were poor. And that was just, I mean, I think everyone was a little bit poor at that time, but for them, they both wanted out of that. And Clyde started like his criminal career pretty young with his brother. They stole some chickens, and that just, put them on the wrong side of the law already. But he actually wouldn't end up in prison until the 1920s, or until 1930 when he was 21. Sorry. And Bonnie was kind of like an okay girl, but she ended up getting married really young. I think she was 15. So just keep in mind that this whole time, like, Bonnie was married, but not to Clyde.
Yes, yeah.
So when Clyde was in jail that first time, this is kind of the start, I think, of just like the ridiculousness that is going to ensue. He escaped with Bonnie's help, but he got picked back up again. And this was a prison farm, which is very common in the South, like prison farms. And this was Eastham State Penitentiary, which is run by the Texas Department of Corrections, or was. I don't know much about it now. But he didn't want to do hard labor, so he cut off 2 of his toes with an axe. And then 6 days later, his mother successfully got his pardon from the governor. So he cut off 2 of his toes for no reason, but this kind of started his battle with the law, if you will. And it's been said that Clyde's ultimate goal of being an outlaw or a gangster, whatever you want to call him, was revenge on the Texas Department of Corrections.
Okay.
I've never spent any time in a Texas jail, so I can't tell you very much, but Bonnie and Clyde met in 1930, and it was love at first sight. I just want to go ahead and get that out of the way. It was love at first sight. It was a great story. But, of course, I often wonder if they were just a perfect storm of a couple. Like, would things have gone the same way if they hadn't met. I think that's kind of what you think about, like, those couples anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But at first, Bonnie and Clyde weren't super well known. They weren't super popular. But then in 1933, they were in Joplin, Missouri, and their gang was raided, and their hideout was raided, and they, like, left in this huge hurry, but they left behind a camera full of film. And that film is kind of what made them famous. I think if you've ever seen the pictures, it's like Bonnie and Clyde, and they're dressed up, and they're in front of a car, and they have tons of guns, and they're kissing, and they're doing so much. Like, they're doing so much, and this was kind of the start of it. I do have a quote from a historian. His name is Jeff Gunn. He's like an author and a historian, and it kind of talks about a couple of them, but he says, John Dillinger had matinee idol good looks, and Pretty Boy Floyd had the best possible nickname, but the Joplin photos introduced new criminal superstars with the most titillating trademark of all, illicit sex. Clyde Barrow and Bonnie Parker were wild and young, and they undoubtedly slept together. So,
well, yeah, I don't think there's any doubt about that.
We know nothing. I'm just saying. So, yeah, so Bonnie was, like, smoking a cigar in the photos. It, like, really got people's attention. And this is also where they started to find some of her poetry. They found a poem called Suicide Salve that she had written. And 1933 was just a really bad year for them. They were also in a car accident. Clyde kind of drove off of a bridge, and they're not sure if there was a fire in the car or if battery acid leaked out, but it burnt Bonnie's leg from her hip, like, all the way down. It was third-degree burns. And clearly they couldn't go get that treated. So for the rest of her life, which was only about a year, she actually couldn't walk. She either had to hop or Clyde had to carry her around. I think they were both quite small, but... and then public opinion turned because on Easter Sunday, they killed 2 police officers in Grapevine, Texas. And this is kind of the part where Bonnie gets a bad rap, I think. Mm-hmm. There was a farmer who witnessed it, and he said that she shot one of the policemen, and then she laughed and said his head bounced like a rubber ball. And that was printed in all of the newspapers, and it was a big deal. And I don't know if that's true. You know, it's kind of like let them eat cake.
Yes, yeah, which is not true.
Exactly. So you never know. But that was kind of when they were like, okay, no, we're going to, like, things are going to change. People were upset with them. But then in 1934, so 1934 would be the end of the road for Bonnie and Clyde. But they kidnapped a police chief in the city of Commerce, Oklahoma, which I don't know where that is, but his name was Percy Boyd, but they actually let him go. They would do that repeatedly. They would kidnap people and just drive them a little bit away, and they would let them go and give them money.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure I don't know.
What was the point?
Sometimes it was for a car. I think sometimes it was just, like, to have a person so they weren't as targeted, because you never want to kill that person that, you know, you don't want to kill a hostage. And Bonnie also asked him to please tell everyone that she didn't smoke cigars. She actually smoked Camels, in case anyone was wondering.
Okay.
But they were basically running in a circle of 6 states. They were exploiting, like, the state line rule that said that police couldn't follow you into different states, which I think, I'm not sure if that's still a rule now. I think that now you can...
I don't think so.
Now you would just call ahead and be like, pursuing criminal.
Well, and also, that's why we have federal
Yeah.
police, because when you cross state lines, it's federal jurisdiction.
Right. So, in 1934, it's May 23rd. We're in the very small town of Gibbsland, Louisiana. It is a very small town. It's right outside of Shreveport, like maybe an hour. It's a very small town, and Bonnie and Clyde are going to meet their friend, Henry Methvin. And at about 9:15 a.m., there is a posse of lawmen. I did not even write down their names. I'm so sorry, but there were 6 of them. And they are a mixture of Texas Rangers and Louisiana law enforcement officers, and they're hidden on the side of the road in these bushes. Today, this road does not have bushes or trees. It's just a road, but there's a marker. And they were about to just give up. They'd been there all night. They were tired. They've been, like, following Bonnie and Clyde for a while now when they heard a car. And Clyde had, like, a penchant for stealing V8s, which are quite loud. So Methvin's dad was parked on one side of the road, which forced them into the other lane. And this is their friend's dad, and Methvin is their friend. And when the car got in the lane, one of the officers, named Oakley, apparently fired first before the order was given to fire at this car. 130 rounds were fired into the car. from like rifles and handguns. And they said Clyde died almost immediately, but Bonnie was screaming. And the coroner said that there were 17 separate entry wounds on Clyde's body and 26 on Bonnie's. And the scene ended up being a complete circus. They didn't mark off the scene. They literally left someone there to watch the car. So all of these people came. They were cutting up their clothes, cutting off their hair, taking the casings from the bullets, the glass from the car. Someone tried to cut off Clyde's trigger finger and his ear. So they finally get them to Arcadia, which is also right down the road from Gippsland. This is all on the interstate now, so you can just, there's a museum, there's a ton of historic sites about this, like right there on the interstate, and their bodies were brought back to Dallas. They wanted to be buried together. But her family wouldn't allow that, and I do think it's important to say that their families were still like loving them. They were like, come visit me, come hang out with me. Their parents were devastated. But Clyde's funeral was on May 25th, and it was private. He was buried next to his brother Buck. The cemetery is called Western Heights Cemetery. It's in Dallas. It's actually close to the public. I tried to go there. You cannot go in. It's close to the public. Bonnie's funeral was on May 26th, and more than 20,000 people attended her funeral. And flowers came from all over. Some were reportedly from Pretty Boy Floyd, John Dillinger, and Benny Binion. She is buried in Crown Hill Cemetery in Dallas. You can just walk right up to it. It's like right under some bushes. I've been there as well. And now Clyde's shirt in the car in Primm Valley, Nevada at Whiskey Pete's Resort. And the posse ended up earning about $200.23 each for their work in capturing Bonnie and Clyde. There was an extremely high reward.
I don't feel like they captured them, though.
Right, well, I think, yeah.
They just murdered them.
They did, they just murdered them. But apparently a lot of people backed out of paying the reward money. And I think there was a poem that Bonnie wrote, and it's actually quite long. It's called The Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde. And I just took the very end of it out.
Okay.
And it says, they don't think they're tough or desperate. They know the law always wins. They've been shot out before. They've been shot at before, but they do not ignore that death is the wages of sin. Someday they'll go down together, and they'll bury them side by side. To few it'll be grief, to the law a relief, but it's death for Bonnie and Clyde. That's so sad.
I like it, though.
I know, she's quite good.
Yeah, that was actually...
it's so sad to me. I don't know, I feel like... I don't know if it's like the whole like lovers thing and they were like together. I don't know. It breaks my heart. I think it's sad. I have really bad taste, by the way. So
yeah.
I just feel very sad for a lot of these people.
So now that we've heard the Ballad of Bonnie and Clyde, I'm just going to give a few of the gangster names that we know in order to kind of prep you for some of the mobsters that I talk about later. So there's Charles Lucky Luciano, who is the father of modern organized crime and the first official boss of the Genovese crime family.
I think so. What the father of organized crime?
I know. He was born in Italy and immigrated to New York City when he was 9. He ran a protection racket for Jewish kids to protect them from gangs. So he would charge them 10 cents and he would protect them from local gangs. Jewish kids, yeah. He would just... he learned the pimping trade, which is what they called it. He was a member of the 5 Points gang, and between 1916 and 1936, he was arrested 25 times for various things. But nothing ever really stuck. Like, he did no prison time for assault, illegal gambling, blackmail, robbery. Arrested 25 times, no prison time. And nobody really knows where Lucky came from, but one of the suspects for why he got his nickname was that he survived a beating and throat slashing from 3 men after he refused to work for another mob boss. And because he survived, he might have been given the nickname Lucky. But he was also known for gambling and stuff too, so I didn't know if maybe that could have been the origin of his nickname.
I'd love to say his name.
I know, Lucky Luciano is such a great name. But he was actually a gunman for a guy named Masseria. And eventually kind of became second in command, but had Masseria killed when he noticed that Masseria was losing the local gang war to Maranzano, who eventually made the 5 families and became the boss of all bosses. So he went to Maranzano, betrayed Masseria so that it got him killed in exchange for kind of being Maranzano's second in command and being the head of Masseria's crime family, essentially.
Hmm.
So that happened. But Maranzano began to see Lucky Luciano as a threat and was planning to kill him, and he got wind of that, so he decided he was going to kill Maranzano first. And so he did.
He's a little extra.
And he became this top dog in organized crime in New York City. And he was eventually arrested, and he was released to go back to Italy, and then he went to Cuba instead, and then he went to Italy, but then he went back to he kind of ran around for a little bit.
Low profile in that.
Yeah, and so he kind of ran around for a little bit. I think he eventually died in Italy, though. And then you also have Bugsy Siegel, who was part of the Jewish mob. And he was one of the most infamous and feared gangsters of his day. He was handsome and charismatic, and he was kind of the driving force behind the Las Vegas Strip and all of that. He was also one of the founders of Murder, Inc. that we talked about earlier.
Oh, Bugsy.
Yes, he was a bootlegger during Prohibition, and when Prohibition ended, he became a gambler. Las Vegas Strip, all of that happened. And he created the Bugs and Meyer gang with Meyer Lansky, who we'll talk about later, and was a boyhood friend of Capone, and also gave him a place to hide out, his aunt's house, when Al Capone was on the run from a warrant for his arrest.
So all the time.
Yes, and he also was the sweetheart of Virginia Hill, who I'll talk about later, and was shot in her home. And it was basically a contract killing, and it's unsolved, and nobody knows who did it. But I will talk about both Meyer Lansky and Virginia Hill in this podcast.
That's always so sad when they die with their girlfriend.
Oh,
she
she
lived.
wasn't there.
No, she lived. But still.
She wasn't there.
It's a horrible scene to come home to. It was my turn. I was just like, oh, sorry. All right. So, this one is one of my favorites.
It's Benny Binion, isn't it?
It is. It's Benny Binion. And if you guys don't know who Benny Binion is, he was literally the most powerful mob boss in Dallas for a while. I've never lived in Dallas, so I'm not sure why I'm so into it right now, but anyway. And if you have ever been to a Horseshoe Casino or to the Fremont Street Experience in Las Vegas, and you see Binion's gaming hall, you can thank Benny Binion for that, because, well, he started it all. I have a great quote to start this all off with. It's from a poker player. They call him Amarillo Slim Preston. And he said
Good
this.
name.
I know, right? He said this at Benny's funeral. He was either the gentlest bad guy or the baddest good guy you've ever seen. And they also say it was very hard for anyone to dislike him. He was just one of those people that was like very likable and stuff. He grew up poor. I think that's kind of a common thread here. They all grew up a little bit poor.
Yeah, all of the ones I talk about as well grew up poor.
Yeah. So
especially poor immigrants were a
Yeah.
lot of the mobsters.
Yeah. His dad was a horse trader.
Okay.
So in North Texas, or north of Dallas, but I mean, like, there's not that much north of Dallas, but whatever. So Benny is kind of interesting. So he was indicted for murder twice and never really went to jail for that. He did go to jail, but not for that. So the first time he allegedly murdered someone, it was a man named Frank Bolding. He was an African-American rum runner. And Benny thought that he was stealing liquor, so he shot him cowboy style, which I think means, like, you draw, like, quickly. But I looked it up, and it was, like, cowboy style shooting contest, and I was like, right now. But I think that's what it is, and that's how he got his nickname. He was called the Cowboy for the rest of his life.
Okay.
And then again in 1936, he killed someone else, a man named Ben Frieden. He was a gaming competitor, so Benny had numbers games all around Dallas, which basically you pick 3 numbers, and then the next day you see if your numbers win, plus dice games. So these are all illegal at the time in Dallas, but he had all of this, and Ben was one of his competitors, and so Benny and one of his boys drove up to where Frank was sitting outside of, like, a hotel, walked up and emptied 2 entire pistols into this man in the middle of the street in the middle of the day. Benny shot himself in the shoulder, turned himself in, and said it was all in self-defense. So the charges were dropped.
Good job, Benny.
Yeah, I know. And
Smart
then,
guy.
I know, right? It's so extra. And then again in 1938, he allegedly killed another competitor. But he was never even indicted for that one. And then there was his biggest feud with Herbert, the cat noble. So called because he survived 9 attempts on his life.
Still, that's not a good nickname.
The cat.
Herbert the Cat Noble? No.
We could just call him the cat. So, like, it was absolutely ridiculous. Like, people were shooting at him. His wife was killed in a car bombing accident that was meant for him.
Noble's wife?
Yes.
Okay.
Benny's wife lived a very long time. But he was eventually killed in 1951. He was driving to his mailbox, and they had rigged, like, dynamite underneath the mailbox or whatever, and it just blew the car to pieces in the middle of the street. But Benny lost his political support in Dallas in about 1946. So he relocated to the fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. But Vegas wasn't Vegas as we know it then. So he actually had a hand in really starting all of this up. And he played around and opened a bunch of different casinos, and then he opened the Benion's Horseshoe Club in 1951. It had these really high limits on everything. It had $500 limits on craps, which is absolutely insane at the time. There were like table games and dice games, and they had carpet, and they had like $2 steak dinners, and they used limos for their high rollers, and it was just like an experience, which is basically what casinos are like now. Mm-hmm. They were the first to give out the free drinks and all of that. So basically he kind of started all of that. And his philosophy was good food, good whiskey cheap, and a good gamble.
Okay.
And his, like, one of the trademarks, which is still a trademark today at Horseshoe Casinos, was he had a horseshoe shape thing, and it was filled with $10,000 bills, and it was $1 million.
Wait. $10,000 bills exist?
Apparently they did in, like, 1951.
Wonder if they still exist. I've never seen...
I haven't either, but I think they used to make very large denominations of bills, and now...
I haven't even seen $1,000 bills.
It didn't look, it was not a lot of bills. There's like a lot of pictures. It's not a lot. But now, if you go to a Horseshoe Casino, they have $1 million wall. It's $100 bills. So it's a whole, like, I used to work at a Horseshoe. So it's a huge wall. And it's like floor to ceiling behind like bulletproof glass, of course.
Right.
And it usually goes like while you're walking into the casino, because there's always security right there to make sure you're not doing anything stupid. But in 1951, Benny lost his gaming license, which means that he could not own a casino in Las Vegas. And then 2 years later, he got caught for tax evasion. And he was sent to Leavenworth in Kansas, which is quite a famous prison, I think. It's a couple of them have been sent there. I couldn't really find the reason that it seems like very infamous. It's just like a medium security federal prison.
Probably the prisoners.
Yeah, there were quite a few of them. So he had 5 years. He ended up selling off his majority shares in the Horseshoe Club. And the Binions wouldn't actually regain full control until 1964. But it's after this, after Benny's stint in prison, that he really made his mark. Have you ever heard of the World Series of Poker?
Yeah.
You can thank Benny Binion for that. He actually created the World Series of Poker. He had like 2 like great poker players to have a game. They played for 5 months. Just absolutely insanity. And then they started inviting like more and more people to like play. And his hope was that one day there would be 50 players. In 2019, there were 8,569 people in the main game. But Benny was like one of those like kind of lucky people. He lived to the ripe old age of 85. He died in 1989 of heart failure, and then was actually inducted into the Poker Hall of Fame.
Oh, wow.
So, yeah. The Binions have since lost control of the Horseshoe. I think his son Jack was put in charge. If you ever go to a Horseshoe and have to go to the steakhouse, it's called Jack Binion's. But they owned it. It was family owned until 2004, and now it's owned by a gaming corporation, just like everything else.
So, I think a lot of people tend to think that being a gangster, being a mobster, especially at this time, was like a white man's game. But I actually wrote about 2 women.
Oh, yes.
Just to show that this is not just a man's game.
Oh, yes.
First one is Stephanie St. Clair. She was an African-American woman who lived in New York City. She was from Martinique.
Ooh.
And she was basically notorious for making payoffs to the New York City police to protect her employees. And her thing was the numbers racket, which was an illegal gambling operation where you pick 3 numbers, and then the next day the numbers are randomly selected. It's like the lottery. And everybody kind of had their territory, and she was sort of the financial backer for the numbers racket. So she would be the one who had the reward money, but she also was the one who got the money as well.
Okay.
But she had a lot of Harlem was under her. Her nickname was Madam.
Okay.
But she was not a madam in
Fair.
the way that we understand it, but her nickname was Madam. In 1930, she was worth $300,000 in that day's money, which is $4.3 million today.
You go, girl.
She was basically called the queen of the numbers racket in Harlem. But around 1932, people knew that prohibition was coming to an end, and a lot of people wanted to get in on her numbers racket. One of them was called Dutch Schultz, who was the beer baron of the Bronx.
That's also a great one.
The beer baron of the Bronx. And he basically wanted it on this. So he bought out others, sometimes at gunpoint, but she would not give in to him.
Good.
So he started taking out like all the people around her, not taking out as in murdering, but he would run this game where he would manage to get them in debt to him, and eventually he would buy them out. So all of the other Harlem numbers racket people began to get under Schultz.
Okay.
He actually threatened her and his thugs, that's what they called them in the rhetoric I read, assaulted her employees. And she basically told the police, she told reporters, she took out an ad in the newspaper. She told a mayor that he was threatening her livelihood. Like, she did not care that this was illegal. She was like, this man is threatening my livelihood.
Brave. Like, slow clap for her, because thank you.
Yeah, and she started breaking the windows of, or having her employees break the windows of white-owned businesses in Harlem that were accepting bets for him. But she finally ended up having to surrender her territory after all of this. But she also sent him a telegram that said, "Don't be yellow. As you sow, so shall ye reap. Madame St. Clair, policy queen." And he was murdered by gunmen sent by Lucky Luciano in 1935.
I knew I liked Lucky Luciano.
Yeah, so...
That's so dark. I can't believe I said that.
She basically kind of lost out on all her territory in her numbers racket. She gave it over to somebody named Bumpy Johnson, but he worked for Luciano, and kind of that whole thing, it kind of became Luciano's territory and all of that, because Bumpy was working for him on the sly.
Okay.
And she eventually died in 1968. But for a while, she was the numbers queen of Harlem.
I like that.
The other one that I absolutely adore is Virginia Hill.
Yes, I adore her as well.
So from the 1930s to the late 1940s, she was called the mob's mistress. And she didn't sleep with all her mob's affiliations, but she wasn't afraid to use sex to get what she wanted.
Okay.
She was affiliated with Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, Anthony Accardo, Jake Guzik, Murray Humphreys, Charles Fischetti, Jack Dragna, Joe Adonis, which she did have sex with, and Bugsy Siegel, which she also had sex with.
Are we sure, though? Is this really... We don't know. We can't judge these people. We don't know.
That's true. Well, I'm going to assume that Bugsy Siegel, because they were sweethearts.
They could have just been playing Scrabble.
Yeah, okay. She was a money launderer, a cash courier, a heroin trafficker, and a mob informant. She didn't inform on the mob, she informed
To the mob.
to the mob on each other.
She's like busy. She's
She was so
girl.
busy. And she would go to Mexico and seduce the heroin sources, essentially, with her beauty and her wealth. Like, she would go down in furs and jewels, and so they would make sure that the mob that she was working for got that heroin deal, essentially. And it turned up Virginia.
Femme fatale, for sure.
Yes, definitely. And she actually got her start partnered with a man from the outfit, and her first ever job was suckering men into bets on horse races. Like, she kind of used her feminine wiles and her beauty to sucker men into bets, and she would get a percentage of the money they made. And eventually, after a while, she joined her on again, off again Beau Bugsy Siegel in Las Vegas to help run the Flamingo. But one day the mob told Virginia, hey, go to Paris.
Oh, that's nice.
So she went to Paris. And Bugsy Siegel was shot in her home. And she found out while she was in Paris. And her kind of usefulness in the mob declined after this, but she really became famous for her testimony later, I think it was in the 1950s, when the IRS tried to pin her for tax evasion. And for a while she kept moving around Europe, like she would hop in and out of Switzerland because she had married an Austrian skiing champion. So she would hop around so that they couldn't catch her. I mean, as you do. You marry an Austrian skiing champion.
If there's any Austrian skiing champions out there.
But her presence in the courtroom was so sensational, and she like came in with her furs, and she was just making the courtroom just bend over laughing. She was just so sassy and so funny and so done with it. And they were asking her questions. Do you know this man? No. Do you know this man? No. And one of my, there are a few quotes I actually love about it. When they asked her about Charles, I believe it was, I'm not sure which Charlie it was, but they asked her if she knew a man named Charlie, and she said, I only met that Charlie once or twice. I don't even talk to him. And they say, you don't like him? She goes, no.
Yes, girl.
And another thing, when they were, and this was about, this was regarding the IRS tax evasion accusations, because they kept asking her if she accepted money from these men. And they asked, do you still bet on the horse races? She goes, now? I don't bet on anything. I'm afraid I'll win, and then they'll say I earned more money than I did.
Yes. Thank you.
And the court was just, you could see the court was just laughing so hard.
We stan a queen.
She was amazing. But unfortunately, and this was during the Kefauver Commission, she did commit suicide in 1966.
Oh, that's so sad.
After a long struggle with depression. But
still, she had every right to be depressed as well.
Yeah. Still iconic.
Still an icon. 100%.
If you have a chance, look up the Kefauver Commission, Virginia Hill's testimony on YouTube or video hosting sites. She is phenomenal.
We stand a queen here.
Absolutely.
How sad. I didn't realize that had happened.
Yeah.
So I guess a couple of the next ones that I have, I think I need to start off by talking about the FBI.
Oh, here we go.
So the FBI sort of started getting their hands a little bit dirty, I think, doing a lot of this stuff. They were leading, so the FBI was like a new baby at this point. It was a new child. We're starting the FBI. There's always been things going on, but now we're going to call it the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And this is like the Hoover era, J. Edgar Hoover, not Herbert Hoover. And I just don't agree with a lot of the things that were done. And I'll sort of talk about them, but one of the most famous agents, besides Hoover himself, to come out of this was called Melvin Purvis.
Okay.
And Melvin led a lot of these manhunts against the criminals, I guess, against these gangsters. So he was the one that was there for Dillinger, for Pretty Boy Floyd, and maybe for I don't remember, but if it was Babyface Nelson as well, but it was quite a few of them. And he had a better reputation in the press than Hoover, but like he was shady. And I have no problem saying that I think that he was very shady. The FBI does have files online now. You can read about all of these people.
Yes, you can.
But they're, in my humble opinion, very one-sided.
Well, yeah, it's from the FBI's point of view.
Exactly. So they make themselves look like good when they're doing this, but he was one of those people that if you're like laying on the ground wounded, he would just have you killed. It wasn't about taking you in alive. And clearly we don't do like dead or alive anymore for, at least for American citizens. I think it's a little bit different when they're hunting terrorists and stuff, but you don't usually hear them saying for American citizens, like bring them in dead or alive. See, okay, this is what I don't understand. Why is the FBI literally going absolutely insane for these people that like were just robbing some banks? Which, I mean, yes, robbing banks is bad. It's now a federal crime, which it was made federal in 1934. That was made a federal crime in 1934. Like that summer.
That's why it was a bad year.
Yeah. But like I mean, some of them sure are like going wild, and some of them are like just robbing banks. And they were like going crazy after them. That's just my opinion. Anyway.
So I have 2 more notorious gangsters to talk about. So I have Meyer Lansky, which is not something that you hear a lot about. He was part of the Jewish mob, and I think a lot of people associate the mob with, today maybe the Russian mob, back then the Italian mob, but there were Jewish mobs, there were Irish mobs, there were Polish mobs.
Literally everyone has a mob.
Yeah, well, any minority, because there were Chinese mobs.
Yeah.
Any minority that really suffered persecution.
Right.
Because the Irish and Italians and Polish and Jews were all really suffering from persecution because they weren't WASPs. They weren't white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. There weren't English mobs.
Right.
Irish mobs, yes, but they were considered almost second-class citizens.
Yeah.
In the late 1800s, early 1900s with their immigration, and they had immigration laws that tried to bar all these people from coming in from those areas because they were causing trouble. But he actually was Polish-Jewish,
Okay.
so he was both. He was born in Belarus, and he was in the Jewish mob, but had a lot of influence with the Italian mob, and they kind of had a partnership. He was called the mob's accountant, and he was an extremely smart guy. He actually was a childhood friend of Bugsy Siegel.
Of course he was.
And they ran the Bugs and Meyer mob, and it was one of the most violent prohibition gangs. He also met Lucky Luciano as a teen.
They were all palling around.
As you might remember earlier, Lucky Luciano would... he ran a protection racket for Jewish kids to protect them from other gangs.
Right.
So one day he tried to shake down Meyer Lansky, and Meyer was not having any of it. So he actually earned the respect of Lucky Luciano, and they were friends ever since.
He was a friendly guy.
Yeah,
He's got a lot of friends already.
Absolutely.
More than anyone else we've talked about.
Yeah, and Meyer Lansky, he kind of ran a lot of gambling operations in Florida, New Orleans, Cuba, later I believe Las Vegas as well. And they were successful because of their mob ties. They bribed law enforcement, and because Meyer Lansky was very mathematically inclined. He was very smart, and he knew the wagering game and the betting game really well. So he knew how to make a profit without having people be disillusioned, I guess, with the gambling racket that they were running. And he was the one, I believe we talked about this before, when all of the mobsters were getting arrested for tax evasion, he moved all of his stuff to a Swiss bank account so that he wouldn't get caught for tax evasion.
He was very smart. It's a good thing he was an accountant, huh?
Yeah, well, the mob's accountant is what he was called. One of my favorite things, though, about Meyer is that he and his gang broke up Nazi rallies in the 1930s.
Oh, yes.
So here's a quote from him. The stage was decorated with a swastika and a picture of Adolf Hitler. The speakers started ranting. There were only 15 of us, but we went into action. We threw some of them out windows. Most of the Nazis panicked and ran out. We chased them and beat them up. We wanted to show them that Jews would not always sit back and accept insults, because he was there with his Jewish mom.
Thank you, sir. Hats off to you.
I was like, we need more of Meyer Lansky's in the world.
See, it's so nice when you hear about them doing such good things. And you're like, hats off to you.
And he actually was involved with the federal government a little bit with Operation Underworld during World War II, in which criminal elements would keep an eye out for German infiltrators.
Oh, that's cool.
He also made a deal with them to protect the warships in New York Harbor if they would release his good friend, Lucky Luciano, from prison, which worked. So his gang basically guarded the warships that were being built during World War II from sabotage.
That's so interesting.
In exchange for his friend being released from prison.
That's so
He also took over the Flamingo Casino after Bugsy Siegel's death. And he actually died at 80 years old of lung cancer.
Oh, poor guy. But I'm glad he lived. Like,
and he was acquitted of tax evasion charges. They did try to bring charges against him, and he was acquitted.
Good.
And nobody knows where all of his money went, because when he died, he had about $50,000 to his name, but they know there's more, and they don't know where it is.
Oh, they can't get into Swiss bank accounts, can they?
No, they can't.
If his family's out there, I could use money.
So my last gangster, if
Okay.
you'd like me to go for my last gangster, and then we can finish off with yours.
Yeah, I'm just going to say a few lines about mine, so you go right on ahead, even though I have 10 pages that I don't need. So
Was Al Capone,
Oh,
otherwise
yes.
known as Scarface. He was a first-generation American. His parents were from Italy. His father was a respectable barber, and his mom was a devout Catholic housewife, and all of their children became criminals. He was from Brooklyn, and he joined local gangs, but he wanted to be a cut above the rest. And there are a lot of stories about him, like somebody stole a widow's laundry basket, and he went and beat up the kids and got her laundry basket back. He wanted to be like a moral gangster, essentially.
I have such a soft heart for all of them. I'm like,
So he got a taste of the gangster life when he was working for as a bouncer at a bar. And this story is where he got the nickname Scarface, which he hated. And it was on his left side, so he would take most of his photos from the right so that you couldn't see his scars, and he would put like heavy makeup on his scars. Let me tell you.
It wasn't lead-based.
Yeah. Let me tell you how he got the scars.
Oh, I'm nervous.
So he approached a girl named Lena Galluccio, and she was with her older brother. And he stopped by her and he said, "Honey, you got a beautiful ass, and I mean that as a compliment, really." Her older brother, of course, jumped to his defense of his sister and cut up Al Capone's face for saying that.
Wow. That's never what you expect, is it?
Yeah, so he hated the nickname Scarface, and he always tried to cover it up. He was later recruited by Johnny Torrio to act as his lieutenant in Chicago, so he picked up and moved to Chicago. He did arrange for the death of Torrio's boss. So Johnny Torrio was sort of a second in command in Chicago.
Okay.
But he arranged for the death of Big Jim, was Johnny Torrio's boss.
Some of the names are awful, aren't they,
I
Big
know.
Jim?
Big Jim was against bootlegging during Prohibition. He said, "We've got enough money." And Torrio and Al Capone, of course, wanted to get in on that lucrative business.
It's never enough, Big Jim. It's never enough.
Capone arranged for the death of Torrio. And some of the things that they would do is they would bomb places that wouldn't take their beer after, of course, Torrio began the bootlegging business with Capone. And then they would lend the money to those places to repair the place so that they were in debt to
Like, that's
the gang.
horrible and also so very genius that I can't even.
Yeah, there were Chicago's beer wars. They did take over a nearby Cicero outside of Chicago and rigged its elections so that people who were not anti-Capone and Torrio, essentially. Torrio actually did not come to foul play. He was arrested and he decided to retire and pass the gang on to Capone. So he never became a victim of Capone.
What a stand-up guy, just
Yes.
retired.
And of course there was the St. Valentine's Day massacre of Bugs Moran's men, and Bugs Moran was he was Irish mob, and he was basically the biggest rival of Capone. But Capone eventually went into prison. He did a prison stint that he arranged, by the way, because after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, they feared retribution from Bugs Moran's people.
Right.
And so he set up his own arrest
These
for his
people are
own protection.
so extra. Like, how, what? I
And
can't even.
He ran his gang from prison by phone.
That's so much. I love it, actually, but it's a lot.
He was called public enemy number 1, but he really wanted to have a good reputation on the people, so he opened up the first soup kitchen during the Great Depression. And he had a great reputation with people. I watched a documentary, and one of the people was a photographer, and he said, "I was there at the racetracks in Capone. I saw him walk by, and he came up to me and he said, 'Hey kid, you betting on the horses?' And he gave him a ticket. He said, 'Horse number 6 is gonna win.'" And that kid made $500, I believe, from that ticket because the horse race was rigged. And
What
Capone knew
luck.
it. And another time, he spilled a drink on a showgirl's dress. And she said it was okay and everything, but he gave her $25 to fix it and said it wasn't okay.
Aw, that's so nice.
$25 in that era was a lot,
Yeah, that's
too.
so nice.
And a lot of the victims that he would, if victims survived, he would pay their medical bills. There was one newspaper guy who was very anti-Capone, and so I believe it was a drive-by shooting. But he survived, and when he came out of the hospital and tried to pay his bill, they said it was already paid.
I'm in awe. Like, that's insane.
And that's not the first time he did that. He would pay for the hospital bills of people who survived his hits.
That's insane.
And one of the famous people that comes along with this is Elliot Ness, as being kind of his opposite. But Elliot Ness really just did a few rapes. Like, he really didn't make much of a difference against Capone. It was, of course, tax evasion. They decoded his bookkeeping. Not his personally, because he didn't keep books, but he had bookkeepers, and they were able to decode their bookkeeping to arrest him on charge of tax evasion. And the issue with this was that was worse than murder during the time of the Great Depression, because even the poor were paying their taxes, and to find out that this guy who was so wealthy was not paying his taxes actually turned the public against him, because originally they were either for him or they were mixed reaction, because he had a soup kitchen. You know, it was, he gave money out. He would pay for hospital bills, and he was very generous with his money, and he always wanted to be seen as a good guy.
Yeah.
But it was tax evasion that actually turned the people against him. And he was arrested, and he suffered from degenerative syphilis for much of his life, and he died in 1947 of cardiac arrest.
Oh.
So that is the end to Al Capone's tale.
But what a story it was. So I have like just 3 more. I'm just going to touch on them a little bit. So first off, we have Machine Gun Kelly.
Not a surprise.
Also known as George Kelly Burns. That was his real name. He was out of Memphis. And okay, so I think this is interesting. His nickname comes from his favorite gun being like the Thompson submachine gun, which is like a Tommy gun.
Tommy gun.
But he's actually never known to have killed anyone. So I'm not sure like what he used that gun for, but like it's whatever.
Take it down to the shooting range.
Yeah, like just like play with it, drive it around. I don't like does it sit in your passenger seat? I don't know. But really I don't know, I feel like he's like a quite famous name, but really what he's known for is he kidnapped this rich guy called Charles F. Urschel, and he kidnapped him for ransom, and like Urschel was actually pretty smart, and he like counted steps and turns, like figured out where he was and was able to tell the FBI when they got loose. So Machine Gun Kelly went to jail, but he had this like crazy reputation from the newspapers and the FBI, and I think his wife also. But he was like a model prisoner. He was in Alcatraz, and he was literally a model prisoner. And then he was moved to Leavenworth, and he died of a heart attack on his 59th birthday. I thought that was a little bit sad. But then the next 2, I think, are going to be Pretty Boy Floyd, and I'm just going to say just a couple things about these guys. But Pretty Boy Floyd and Babyface Nelson.
Great names, both of them.
100%. So Pretty Boy Floyd was a bank robber. His first arrest, he was 18. And then he got arrested again a couple years later, and he started robbing banks after he got arrested. After he got paroled. But his nickname actually comes, he would work in the oil fields in slacks and a button down. So they called him Pretty Boy.
All right.
And apparently he absolutely hated this name. But over his criminal...
Shouldn't have worn slacks and a button down in the oil fields.
Right? Over his criminal career, he killed 10 people and robbed about 30 banks. But there was this myth about him. He was viewed very positively. There was this myth about him that when he would rob banks, I don't know if they could ever prove or disprove this 100%, he would destroy all the mortgage documents in the bank. So people wouldn't have to pay their mortgage, they would just own their house. So if that's true...
Robin Hood.
Exactly. So he was actually called the Robin Hood of the Cookson Hills.
Oh, well, there we go.
And, he kind of got on everybody's radar after the Kansas City Massacre. The Kansas City Massacre, which was a gunfight. They were trying to move this one guy, and there was a shootout, basically. And they said that he was there, but the Kansas City police received a postcard that said, "Dear sirs, I, Charles Floyd, want it made known that I did not participate in the massacre of officers at Kansas City." Signed, Charles Floyd. But he actually became what we know as a public enemy. He's public enemy number 1 on July 23rd, 1934. And he was shot by FBI agents and local police led by Purvis in a field in East Liverpool, Ohio. So basically his car broke down, they hit like a light pole because it was real foggy, and he went into East Liverpool and had dinner at his friend's like bar, and he was like sitting outside in a car, and like him and the cops saw each other, so he got up and he ran to the tree line that was like behind the bar, and he got shot in the arm, and he was laying on the ground. So the local police were also here, but the FBI is like, no, they weren't. They're lying. So anyway, he's laying on the ground, and he's wounded, and Purvis is apparently questioning him. And another guy is standing there holding like a machine gun on him. And Purvis is questioning him, and he's not getting the answers he wants. So he tells the guy with him to shoot him point blank with the machine gun. Killed him instantly. Which is why I said earlier that Purvis doesn't want to bring anyone back alive.
No.
And that's murder.
Yeah.
That's murder, and I don't think there's any way around that. He had him murdered.
Yeah.
Because he could have easily, if he's already on the ground, he could have easily taken him in.
Yeah.
So that's murder. But his body was put on display. That's pretty common for these guys. Their bodies were put on display. And he had the largest funeral ever in Oklahoma history. Between 20 and 40,000 people went. And the last one I'll talk about is Babyface Nelson. He also hated his nickname. And his name wasn't even Nelson. His name was Lester Joseph Gillis. But that was one of his aliases, was George Nelson. And his wife, Helen, was always with him for all of this. And he literally started his criminal career at age 12. And I kept reading that he killed more FBI agents than anyone. I think he killed 3.
Okay.
And he only killed 7 people, which doesn't, that's still a lot of people.
Oh, well, yeah.
But like, the last person killed 10, so...
Thinking about somebody like Al Capone. Granted, Al Capone never killed anybody directly.
Right. It was just like someone was kind of killing them. And he was like robbing banks, and he was, apparently just like killing people willy-nilly, which doesn't really seem like it was the case, but it's beside the point. And everything came to a head for Babyface once again, 1934. But so on November 27th, there was a shootout with the FBI, and everybody got away. And then the next day, like, he was driving one way and an FBI car was driving the other way, and they like saw each other, so they started all like turning around. It ended up with him in pursuit of the FBI car. Why wouldn't you go the other way? And then they all kept doing, and this sounds like a television show, but he kept doing the like pull in, and they would like shoot past.
Sounds like a Scooby-Doo scene.
It does, and apparently that kept happening, and then he was like pulled in right here, and like the agents were like right here.
That doesn't help for people listening to the podcast.
Right, so they were like parked, and the agents were parked like diagonal, I guess, from them. And they are all out of their cars shooting at each other, and he gets shot in the stomach. And he hands his gun off to like his pal that's with him, and his wife is like hiding in the car. And he's been shot in the stomach, and they found out that damaged his liver and his pancreas. It was a mortal wound. So he walked up and killed these 2 officers, like mortally wounded, and he ended up getting shot 8 times in the legs during that walk. And they made it back to a hideout, and he died in bed beside his wife at 7:30 that night. And then his wife hadn't been caught, and I think this part really gets me. So J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI had an internal memo that was like leaked to the press, and the press said that the FBI had issued a death warrant for a woman because the memo said, "Find that woman and give her no quarter." And she hadn't even done anything. She was just there. She ended up spending a year in jail. They clearly gave quarter, which I think was good, because could you imagine if they hadn't? But that's all I have for those today. But
I want to know though why we stopped using those nicknames. Like, why we stopped giving people nicknames like that.
Same. Same. I don't. Now we just have like. I don't know, now I feel like it's like really rich people that just get like shortened versions of their name or something. You don't have like fun nicknames.
Yeah, like Babyface or...
The Cat.
Well, okay. Exceptions. Scarface.
Exactly. Well, I don't know if I want to be called Scarface. I'm a little bit too vain for all that, but I feel it.
All right, this has been Lindsay the Shiv Shirkey.
Oh, and Moneybags.
Thanks for listening.
Sorry, it was just so many pauses. Yeah, thanks for listening, guys. We'll be back next week.
Bye, guys.